We'll take a look at Daf Chaf in
Okay.
Masechet Shekalim, and this is the sugya called Basar Shenis Alim Min Ha'ayin. You have a piece
Okay.
of meat, and there's no way of knowing whether
Right.
this is the same piece of meat that you left there if you find the piece of meat later on and you didn't pay any attention. And Rav, on the previous Amud, on Daf Yutes Amud Beis, he was the one who was very machmir about Basar Shenis Alim Min Ha'ayin. So the Gemara tells a number of stories now that seem to indicate how much we have to be concerned, even in cases where it seems a little bit like a far out improbability that it would have been switched. You know, the meat that you know was kosher would switch with unkosher. Tad Barnash, there was one person, Hava Mahalik B'Shuka, he was going in the marketplace, buying kupad, and he had with him a piece of meat. Asa daisa. Daisa is some sort of a non-kosher bird called a daya, perhaps a raven. The chatve mine, and this bird grabbed the meat and utlakte and threw it down in a different place, a different location. Chazar boy mes vino, so that person wants to go back and pick up and retrieve his piece of meat and eat it. And he assumes that if this bird took the meat and threw it there, it's still the same piece of meat. Amalei Rav Asulucha. Rav says that's called Basar Shenis Alim Min Ha'ayin. And Dana Amar, and I'm going to be of the opinion, says Rav, that Basar Nevela Havas Te'ina Utlakte, that perhaps this raven was carrying a piece of non-kosher meat, of what we call nevela, and it threw down that piece of meat in the place where you found it, and nasbahu urchana, and the meat that you had, it took in place. I guess this daya wanted to eat kosher meat, so rather than get stuck with the nevela that he ate, he put down this piece of meat, took the kosher meat, and what you're looking at now is the nevela. And now we go on to other similar halachas about yayin, because in the case of yayin, we don't drink wine from goyim. In the case of cheeses, we don't eat cheeses that come from goyim. So here's a story about a river which is called Ginai. Shataf Zikin. Zikin are called nodos yayin shel Yisrael, flasks of wine that were Jewish wine, that were kosher wine, and the waves came from this river and took them away and brought back the nodos. Also, uvdi kavi Rabbi Yitzchak Rebbe Lazar. Now the question came in front of Rabbi Yitzchak: are these the same nodos that were taken by the river and now returned by the river? Or maybe these are different nodos and they belong to goyim and it's yayin nesach. Omar, Rabbi Yitzchak said, Yechkamun, you'll have to be very smart here, and shapoya kidrahon. If you want to drink this wine, then you have to know that you can identify this node, this cask, as yours, meaning maybe you tied it in a certain way and you have a tvias ayin that this is definitely yours, then it's mutter. But if not, it's asa, because we're afraid that maybe this river brought back nodos from other marketplaces that belong to goyim. Another story about nikuneka. These are kankanim shel cheres, some sort of barrels that are made of pottery. Dishkach beknishta de Buli. There was a city in Babel called Buli, and in the synagogue of that city, they found these kankanim of cheres. And once again, we have an issue. Also, uvda kome kume de Rabbi Yirmiyah. The question came in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah: how do we judge these barrels? Omar, and he declared, Yischakmun Skoraya Aviditon. Take a look at the Roshem. The Roshem is, I guess, the way that they closed up these barrels. They painted them in a certain color. Can you identify them and be absolutely sure that they are yours? And then Mutarim, and if not, they are Asurim. Even though the Rashmi Sorleo points out that in a Beis HaKnesses, we would normally say that for sure the Goyim are not going to inhabit a Jewish synagogue. He says that here the word Beis HaKnesses, that phrase, should not be taken in its classic form to refer to synagogues, but rather these are gathering places, like assembly halls. And Goyim come there, and that's where they have apparently public debates between the Jews and the non-Jews about religious issues. And I'm thinking that if not for the Rosh Leo, perhaps in this situation, you would have thought that even if you don't recognize the nodos, the very fact that most of the people that inhabit, that frequent that area are Jews, that rove is enough to rely on the fact that it's Jewish in origin. And the Gemara quotes this story to tell you that no, you need an additional proof. You have to be able to identify the nodos. Let me just take a drink for a second. Okay. So now we're going to have a story about cheeses, because the Gemara says at the end of Avodah Zarah that the Rabbanan enacted a gzera that we're not allowed to eat cheese from the goyim. So let's see what happens here. I just want to check out one thing. See if I missed one thing here. He says here that nukunika are containers of wine. Okay, so that wasn't exactly clear 100%, but it makes sense that the issue was Yayin Nesach. And Rabbi Yirmiyah Paskin, that you have to be able to identify these red dyes, it seems, because Skorayu, he says, is Roshme Kankanim Bitseva Sirka. On the top of these containers, they used to put stripes of red in order to identify them as Jewish wine. And you have to be able to identify that, otherwise we assume it's Yayin Nesach. Okay, so now before we get to the cheese, I fast forwarded a little bit. He says, Gedi. Now he finds a piece of meat from a young goat, tzli, and it was roasted. Where did he find it? Ishtakach bisrake, in the marketplaces, the Gufta of a city called Gifta. And now we have two issues. Number one, if you find such a piece of meat, are you chayven hachraza? And you have a mitzvah vashavas aveda. And number two, do you have to suspect that maybe this meat came from a guy, and therefore it's treif? Hitirua. They allowed the finder to eat the meat, and they solved both problems. Mishum shnei dvarim. Mishum mitzia, as far as the issue of whether or not he's chayiv in achraza, there they were matir mishum rov mahalchi drachim. What happens is that if you lose something in a public area which is frequented by myriads of people, then we assume that the bailam are misyayish. And if you're wondering whether or not this piece of meat might be asur because it belongs to a guy, we have a principle called rov, that if there's a place, a location, or a road, and most of the people who frequent the road are Jewish, we can assume that this meat came from Jews. That's what the Gemara clarifies. Mishum mitzvah, as far as the mitzvah of mitzvah is concerned, there's no mitzvah, no obligation to announce that you found this meat because the Bible was Misyayish, the Tani. We have a brisa that teaches us that there are many scenarios in which we assume that the Bailam are Misyayish. And the brisa enumerates those scenarios. Number one, Hamatzil miyad hari. There was an object that was taken by a lion, and somehow you got it out of the lion. Well, I would assume a snake also, like a cobra. Miyad hagayis, or it was taken away by the non-Jewish soldiers, or mishunas hanar, which means the tides of the rivers, mishunas hanar, or the fast-flowing streams of the river, so that the person in all these scenarios gives up hope. He doesn't think he has a chance in a million of getting back and retrieving his object, so he's Messiah, Istaria Gdola, or from a public place. And that's exactly the case that we had of the Gdi, where he found it in the shuk of Gifta in a public place. It's Ariel Shalom Abayla Misyashem. So that's halach of Yerush. Now, I would assume, I'm not learning Elu Mitzias now, that if you find something in a public place, the one who lost the object thinks that what are the chances that after the so many myriads of people that frequent that place, that one person is going to find it, he's going to return it. So you assume that in a public place, anyone who finds it will keep it, and therefore you're Messiah. What about the Isra Achila? Maybe this piece of meat belongs to a guy. They were matrit mishum rov mahalchei drachim, because most of the people who frequent that area are Jews, and mishum shchitas nachrid, if they weren't worried about the kashrus of the meat, and they didn't suspect that maybe it was slaughtered by a guy, vishtakach min debeis Rebbe. At the end of the day, Hashgacha would have it that they were able to somehow, it doesn't say in the Gemara exactly how, but to clarify and establish that this meat actually came from the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So it was. It turns out to be the right psak. In the footnote here, he quotes Rabbeinu Meshulam, one of the commentaries, and Rabbeinu Meshulam invokes a sugya in Bab Metzia called Zuto Shal Yam, which are places where it's very, very difficult to retrieve an object that fell down to the bottom of the river. And he seems to assume that in the Gemara there are two approaches. Shnei drachim levar madua huta mishum mitzia. And one of them is because the Bailam were Misyayish. And according to that logic, the basar is mutter b'achila as well. Or because Havedas Achum, we assume it was lost by a guy, and that's enough to establish that you're allowed to keep it for yourself, but Einochinam, you're not allowed to eat it. Now we have the story of the cheese. Igul de Guvna, they used to sell cheese that was in a round shape. Ishtaka b'fundaka de Levi, somewhere in the area where Levi lived, they found a piece of round cheese, and it seems that the word fundak indicates that it was an inn, and Levi owned a kind of a motel, and there were many different guests who stayed in this motel. Some of them were non-Jews, but he tirua on two counts. Number one, is there an obligation to return this object, to look for its owner? Number two, do I have to assume that perhaps it was lost by a guy? Mishum mitzia, as far as the chiyuv of returning it, they were matrit mishum rov mahalchi drachim, I'm sorry. It works like this. Mishum Metzia, they were matir, and Mishum Rov Malchei Drachim, they were matir. And now the Gemara explains. Mishum Metzia, they were matir because of the assumption that the Bailam were Misyayish, because a hotel is like a public place. The Tani that we had a brisa very similar to the brisa that we had before, Hamatzil, Miyada Gayis, if we find something in the hands of the soldiers, or Miyad Ari, or Mishunas Hanor, Hayam Mishunas Hanor, it's on the bottom of the sea, or it was taken by the waves of the river, Mias Taraya Gedola, or perhaps he found it in a place where many people frequent, he calls it a makom shemahalik rabin, umiflatya gedola, he finds it in a great shuk, where they sell and they buy in the marketplace. Harel shalom neshabayel misyashim. Fine. What about being materid for achila? Maybe it's gvinas aku. Mishum rov mahalchei drachim. Most of the people who frequent that fundak, that inn or motel of Levi, were Jewish, and therefore there's no reason to suspect mishum gvinas aku. And then, as Hashkacha would have it, they were able to clarify actually where this cheese came from, Vishtakach, and they found out that this came from the house of Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi. Now, I'm a little bit confused. Maybe you'll enlighten me on this. If they finally identified these objects, like, for example, in the previous case where they found a piece of meat and they were able to establish that it came from Beis Rebbe, or in this case where they found a round cheese and they were able to establish came from Rabbi Lazar, I don't understand why they didn't return it to its proper owner. Unless what the Gemara means when it says Beis Rebbe, it doesn't mean that they knew it belonged to Rebbe. But Beis Rebbe includes his whole entourage, maybe, all his people. I don't know. Let me just see if by chance there's any note on this. Let's see. No. I don't see anything offhand, but maybe it's there. Amar Rabbi Mana Kume Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Mana said in the presence of Rabbi Yossi, Anan Chamyon Rabbanan Machrizin. I can testify to the fact that Chachamim, great sages, even in a case where they found something in a public area, they would go ahead and they would announce it and they would return it. If somebody could give Simanim, he could identify it as his. In other words, they did not rely on the halacha of Makom Sharab is Yesh. Amalei, so Rabbi Yossi turns back to Rabbi Mana and he says, he like throws the ball back in his court. He says, At ihavyasa mishkach, if you were the one who found an object in a place where there are multitudes of people, Rabbi Mitzuyim Cham, lo nasbas, he asked him rhetorically, would you not take it for yourself? You would also assume that it's Yeush. So you're talking about Rabbanon, great sages, who were super pious. They returned the object because of Midas Chasidus. But according to the strict letter of the law, there's Yeush, and you don't have to return an object to a Bailim who are Misyayish. And Rav Yossi adds another point over here. And he says to Rabbi Mana, I know about your own father, Rabbi Yonah Avuv, Lo Amar came. He didn't say, well, if you find an object, a lost object in a public place, you should be machriz. Ela Amar, he used to hope and pray, Alavai, Kad Nishkach, when I find something that's worth something, Nishkach min piyusa velugo. I should find a lost object in a place where Rabbim Mitzuyim Sham. He gives two examples. One is Pesach Beis HaKnesses, and the other is a Beis HaMedrash, where the Rabbim Mitzuyim Sham, and I would take it for myself. So your father said, I would like to be lucky and find something in a public place so that I can keep it for myself. The Gemara concludes, Afilu came, even after Rabbi Mona heard this from Rabbi Yossi, nevertheless, he once found something in a place where Rabbi Mitzuyim Shavalo Nasiv, he did not take it for himself, but rather he was Noe Keminim Chasidus. He went piously over the strict letter of the law, and he was machriz it, and he returned it to its owner. Now, what confuses me about this Gemara is that if you find something in a synagogue or in a house of study, why would you be Messiahish? Why would you assume that the Bailam are Messiahish? Right? He says to him that, oh, if I can find a lost article in an intersection. Oh, he says here in the English, an intersection, a public place. Let me just see. See, my commentary in the Masifta is relying on the Talmud Rash Barash, whereas the English translation here is relying on the Rash Soleo. But the Rash Barash says that he was claiming Rabbi Yonah Halavai should find it in a base medrash. I'm not sure, in a public place, you would say that out of the many, many people who traverse that area, who's going to find it and return it to me? But if you find it in a base medrash or a base hakneses, I'd like to believe that the finder would return it. All right, now we're up to the Mishnah of Behema.
I have one question.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
Why I know this might be a hard question, but why does the Gemara feel the need to go through about 6 cases that seem to be identical, all proving 2 points, Misyayish and Rav?
I think because there are different chumras havera. I'll give you an example. Stam yenam, if you find wine, then there are bundle with choshesh that it is yayin nesach, which is an Isser Hana from Avodah Zarah, which is called Cherem in the Torah. That has its own chumras. In the case of Basar, Hazal were afraid that it might have been shechted by a guy, and it's nevela.
Right.
And that's also an Isser, which is what we call metampe misalev. So it could be the yayin, although there's a chash of Stam Yeno might be like Yain Nesach, but nevertheless it's an Isa Gavra, it's not an Isa Chefta, whereas Basar, if it's Nevela, that's an Isa Chefta, that's Metamte Mesalev. That really can mess up your whole spiritual system. In the case of Gvina, here, Chazal took a very extreme position on Gvina because people were very laid back about Gvina. The whole problem of Gvina is something called rennet. Something that was used as an agent, to cause the milk to curdle. And even though it's batel barov technically, but it's a davar hamamid, and a davar hamamid is not batel barov. So the Chazal sometimes went overboard with chumrah upon chumrah with regard to Gvina because of the fact that people were very careless about Gvina. They would buy Gvina from Goyim. I think even today, by the way, you'll find, not in Clanton Park, but in certain neighborhoods, you'll find that people, they'll eat all sorts of cheeses and they're not makbid about it.
Right. Okay.
But as far as Yeish is concerned, I would say the Gemara is really just repeating, the same principle over and over again. And with each story, you see, it like hakarain in your cup, knocking into your brain,
Right.
that you can rely on a public place and assume that there's Yehush Bailim. And that led the Gemara to wonder whether or not there's room to advocate and recommend in favor of a Midas Chasidus. There's a possibility that you might identify the owner. Technically, you're allowed to keep it even if you could identify the owner. But why would you want to keep an object that belongs to someone else.
Right.
And that has to do with the definition of Yeush, whether Yeush is Hefker or Yeush only removes a person's right to claim Gzela, but it doesn't become the finder's until he makes a kinyan on it. So if the finder is a chassid, he's not going to make a kinyan on a lost object. He's going to do his utmost to try to identify the owner who lost the object.
Okay.
So there's Migdal Eder. So there's an area outside of Yerushalayim, but close to Yerushalayim, which is called Migdal Eder. And it has a certain distance from Yerushalayim. And the Mishnah uses that distance as a shiur to measure a place that is considered within Yerushalayim, if it's within that area. And if you have that radius, that measurement in any direction of Yerushalayim, that would be equal to the distance between Yerushalayim and Migdal Eder, then it's considered like Yerushalayim. And that's a big chumrah. What's the chumrah? Because we apply a principle called Rov Behemos Yerushalayim Kodshim. Amazing. That most of the animals that are brought into the city of Yerushalayim are Kodshim. In general, in a large city, a metropolis, people don't let animals float around and lose their animals. But in Yerushalayim and its very close suburbia, extensions, there was a massive amount of behemos in the city or in the outskirts of the city because they brought these animals to Yerushalayim to be makriv them on the Mizbeach. So now you find an animal either in Yerushalayim or on the outskirts of Yerushalayim, within close proximity. What do you do in such a case? You're a good guy. You find the animal. We assume it's kodshim, but now you got a problem. What kodshim is it? Go rack your brains and figure out whether it's an olah, whether it's shlomim. Most karbanos were either olah or shlomim, even though Osham is quite, there are many scenarios in which you're chayav an Osham, but each one of those scenarios are very rare. You stole something and then you took a shvuah, and then you admitted that you took the shvuah, so you're chayav an Osham. And then we have korban chatos. Again, chatos might be a little bit more commonplace, but nevertheless, a chatos is only if you violated one of the 36 Isurei Kares, B'shogeg. But olos and shlomim, wow, they were very popular. But there's one difference in terms of identifying the animal between an olah and a shlomim. An olah can never be a female animal. A female animal could be chatos, it could be shlomim, but it can never be an olah. Therefore, the Mishnah says charim olos. If you find a male animal, you can assume it's olos. The Gemara is going to ask, what do you mean to assume it's olos? Shlomim could be the male or female. So why does the fact that it's a male animal prove to you that it's an olah? The kavos could not be an olah, and since again the most popular kodshim were either olos or shlomim, we assume it was shlomim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, wait a minute, it's Erev Pesach. There's a massive amount of lambs and goats, young goats that are year old that are brought into Yerushalayim for Korban Pesach. Everybody and their uncle is coming, converging on Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach. And therefore, Roy L'Psachim, if you find an animal that could be a Korban Pesach, for example, it's number one is Zachar, because the Korban Pesach has to be a male animal. Number two, it's Tamim, there's no blemish. Number three, it's got to be ben shnasa. It's got to be within the first year. Again, how you identify the animal's age, I don't know. In Israel, we have something called a Tudat Zahut. I don't know if is there something in Canada like that? What do you, identity card or something that has your birthday on it?
Birth certificate or whatever. But,
but you don't, do you, I don't know, Ira, do you carry around your birth certificate with you?
I have it in my wallet, yeah.
Oh, why is that?
I don't know. Just so when you need identification, it's an easy piece of
Oh, I see.
identification.
And a driver's license is not
I have
sufficient.
that too. Yeah, I have that too.
But in any event, here in Israel, like I don't carry it around, but a lot of people carry around a Tudat Zahut.
Right. Yeah,
So it has your birth date
yeah,
on it, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
I don't know, the last time I met a young sheep or a young kid, a goat, I asked them for a Tudat Zahut. They didn't have one. So I don't know exactly how you would know,
Right.
but I guess there are experts who could look at the animal and tell you it's very
You
young.
know.
And the fourth condition is it's got to be either kvasim or izim. Is then lipsachim. Then let me ask the question, says Rabbi Yehuda. Shouldn't I assume because of the massive volume of korbanos psachim that it's a korban pesach? And his answer is it depends. Kodem l'regel shloshim yom or toch shloshim yom. The cutoff point is 30 days. 30 days before Pesach, which is Shushan Purim. At that point, everybody starts getting involved in Sholim, V'Darshin, Bilchas HaPesach, at the beginning of Pesachim, and therefore they're careful about Chametz, and they also start designating their animals as a Korban Pesach. So if you find it after 30 days, meaning if you find it on the 16th of Adar, then you can assume it has all the conditions of being a Korban Pesach, then you treat it as a Korban Pesach. However, if it's lacking one of those conditions, or alternatively, it has all those conditions, but it's 30 days plus before Pesach, then we go back to the Psak of the Mishnah and the Reish of the ruling, and if it's a Zachar, it's an Ola, if it's an Akeva, it's Shlom. Now, it's interesting, because the implication of Rabbi Yehuda is that if I find this animal, this young sheep or young goat, this kid, within 30 days, and it has all the qualifications of a Korban Pesach, I could bring it as my Korban Pesach, because there's no way I can return it to its owner. He can't identify it. And even though he was mafresh it as a Korban Pesach, not me, but it doesn't matter, because I can take someone else's Pesach, once it's Yerush, and now I can make a kinyan on that Korban Pesach, and I could bring it as a Korban Pesach, even though I didn't do the Hakdasha, I wasn't Makish it. But I can bring it as a Korban Pesach. Barishona, in the original historical period of time, when they found animals, the law is that a Korban Ola has to, and a Shlomim, both of them, have to be accompanied by Nisachim. Nisachim include Yayin and Soles and Shemen, and that's an expensive business to pay Nisachim. But now you found the animal, and it's a lost animal, and it's Kodshim. You better dig into your pocket and pay for the Nisachim. I mean, the good news is that you'll get credit up on high for bringing a Korban with Nisachim. The bad news is it's going to cost you a pretty penny. Maybe even American dollars. I don't know. Or if the Canadian dollar's on par. I don't know.
Well,
I remember I was zocher to live in Canada when the Canadian dollar was on par. I remember that. I mean, it doesn't do me any good today, but the mashkin Achu maybe nisachera. We could actually confiscate the property of the finder until he coughs up the money for the nisachim. That was the original halacha, the law. But chazu lios manichim osa uborchem. People saw animals in Yerushalayim and they ran away. They would not want to be zocher. It just didn't make sense for them financially to pick up the animal and have to bring it as a korban and shell out of their pockets for the nesachim. And they refused to pay for the nesachim, so it would be better off leaving it as is, let it roam through the streets. The Be'eri adds another sentence here. He says, Sharei lo nitvas halevi, a person who on their own initiative voluntarily brings a carbon like a shlamar and ola, he's very excited about bringing the sachim. He's a nediv lev. He's got his heart in it. But
Sure.
I'm a finder. I happen to find a sheep, a little shepsela, walking through the streets of Yerushalayim. I'm going to close my eyes and look the other way because I'm not in a div lev. And now what happens is we're in trouble because we have to encourage people to find these animals and bring them to the Beis Hamikdash because we believe that they were sanctified as a carbon. So as Kinu, the Bezdin made a takana, an enactment, that we go into the Trumas Halishka and we will use communal funds to purchase the Nesach. And now, once we get into this first takana of Bezdin, the Mishnah goes on to enumerate another 6 takanos. Amar Rabbi Shimon, Shiva Dvarim, Hiskinu Bezdin. So this was the first of them. If you find an animal, we'll collect the monies for the Nesachim for the Trumas Halish. Number 2, Nachri Shesholach Olaso B'Bdinas Hayam. Now we learned earlier in Shekalim and Sesugin Chulin that a Nachri is included in what's called the Darim and the Davos. And now the guy who's living abroad takes upon himself a pledge and he sends a carbon ola to the Migdash. Not only that, Sholach Iman Nesachim. He's even attaching the monies for the Nesachim that have to accompany the carbon ola. Is Kraven Mishalo. He sent the money. We're not going to lose a penny. On the contrary, we'll give the Mizbeach an extra carbon. The Mizbeach is like a living entity. You know, we want to give the Mizbeach every opportunity to be a vehicle, a medium for Akrovas HaKarbon. But in Lav, who's going to pay for the Nesachim? You? Me? Why should I have to dig into my pocket to pay for these Nesachim? So they made a takana that will be makriv the carbon. We can't be makriv the carbon without Nesachim if it's an ola. But Mishel Tzibur, because we don't want to be mafsid the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach has rights to this carbon that was sent by a guy. And in order to fulfill the desire, so to speak, of the Mizbeach to have this carbon, the Tzibur will shoulder the financial expense of the Nesachim. Number 3, V'chein ger shemes. Now a ger, if he wasn't married, he has no yarshim. And he niach zvachim, he left karbanos that he was mafresh as karbanos. Im yesh lo nesachim, if he was already during his lifetime was mafresh nesachim, kravim mishalot, like the previous case. Will be makrivit, and we have the accompanying nesachim. In Lav, now who's going to want to pay for these nesachim? Nobody owns his possessions; they're all hefker. He has no yarshim. His craven mishal tzibur, because he was mafresh them during his lifetime. The tzibur will shoulder that expense. Number 4. Tonight, bezenu al kohen gadol shemes shetei minchaso craven mishal tzibur. We have a daily carbon, which is called minchas chavitin, that's made from an asir sa'efa, and it's brought daily by the Kohen Gadol, morning and evening. He takes the asiris ha'efa, he splits it into 2, half he brings in the morning, half in the evening, with a lug and a half of shemen, etc., and now he died. And the Mizbeach is crying out for that minchas nesachim, but there's no Kohen Gadol to hear the cry. Is craving Mishal Tzibur. According to Tanakama, no one, not even the heirs of this Kohen Gadol, have a financial obligation to pay for this mincha. So the Tzibur will shoulder the burden. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer disagrees. Michel Yarshim. There's a financial shibud on the nechasim of the Yarshim. Why? Because the Kohen Gadol in his lifetime had a shibud mamon, a monetary lien, L-I-E-N, on his property to pay for the minchas chavita. And this is a pella to me because what kind of shiva does he have? I mean, the man died. Unless he was mafresh, that's a different story. So let's say he died midday and he brought the minchas chavitim of the morning. He didn't bring the afternoon minchas chavitim. That could be a case. In any event, the Mishnah continues and says that both the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda shlema hoisa kreva, that when the Kohen Gadol was alive, he would bring a full asiris ha'efa. He would split it into two. Now he's gone, and we're digging into, according to Tanakama, the moment of the tzibur to bring the minchas chavitim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we're forcing the Yarshim, the heirs, to pay for the minchas chavitim. It has to be brought shlemos. And we're going to have a whole sugya sagamar about what that means. There's one possibility that it means we're going to have to double the amount because the minchas chavitim of the morning is going to have to be the equivalent to what the Kohen Gadol would have brought both morning and evening. And the same is true for the minchas chavitim of the afternoon. Now we're up to number 5. The 5th takana was ala melech ala eitzim. This is hegdesh. Sheyu konim neosimim. Now normally, with regard to hegdesh, there's an iser me'ilah. And certainly with regard to melech and eitzim, which are used for hegdesh, there's an iser me'ilah. But the Bezdin made a takana that there's no alleviating the iser me'ilah, and the kohanim are allowed to use the melach. Let's say, for example, the kohanim are eating the basar kodshim. They want to put salt on it and enjoy the benefit of the salt. It enhances the taste of the meat. Or let's say they have oros. The law is that an ola is kulo kolil, but the hides of the oros are designated for the kohanim. And the kohanim want to use the salt to tan the oros. Or, for example, the eitzim. They want to take the kodshim, the basar kodshim, and they want to make a little fire, a campfire, and they want to use the eitzim of hegdesh. Or perhaps they're very cold. The feet of the kohanim were directly on the ground, the cold flat. So they wanted to heat up from the eitzim, and they would burn them. And the Bezdin made a takana that there's no iser me'ilah. And the question is, how does Bezdin have the authority to alleviate, to remove an iser me'ilah? The 6th takana is para. So we're dwelling with a para aduma, and you have to burn the para. And after you burn the para, you have the afer, the ashes, and then you mix the ashes with water, mayim chayim. And l'chora, there might be me'ilah in the ashes. The ashes are therapeutic. Lo yu molin b'afra. That if somebody, and it doesn't have to be a kohen in this case, wants to enjoy the benefit of the afer, he's not guilty of me'ilah. And you wonder why they made such a takana. After all, the afer of a para aduma was not so common. It was kind of rare. And to allow people to use the afer of the para for their own purposes, that's a pill. And finally, the last of the 7 takanos is alakinim hapsulos. And what we're talking about now is a woman who gave birth, or she was a zava, and some of these halachas apply to a zav as well, and she has to bring a kan sipor, meaning 2 birds, one for ola and one for chatos. And the law is that she doesn't have to actually bring the birds to the Beis Hamikdash. That's a complicated procedure because capturing birds and making sure that they're pure, tahorim. So the law is that they can bring the funds. They put the funds of kinim into a shofar, into a receptacle, and that was earmarked for Bezdin to buy with those funds on behalf of, let's call her Rachel, 2 birds. And now what happens is that lo and behold, the birds flew the coop. Or it turns out that the birds had a certain psul. Let's say they got a blemish. So who's going to now be obligated financially to replace these birds so that she, the Oledes or the Zava, could have this kakrov on her behalf? And the takana was you both mitzel tzibur. According to Tanakama, the replacement of these two birds was a financial responsibility that was incumbent upon the tzibur. They would take the monies from the Trumas Halishka and buy on behalf of this woman or the Balim a replacement carbon so that they could fulfill their obligation vis-a-vis the kapara netara of the Khan tzibur. And who dissents? Rabbi Yossi, Omer, no. We go back to the vendor. We go back to the seller. He who sold the ophos will not be considered, shall we say, exonerated from his obligation to supply the kinim simply because he sold it. There's a built-in condition that in event that these birds turn out to be psulos and are disqualified for the mizbeach, he himself will have to suffer the loss, and he will have to replace those kinim, those birds that were disqualified. According to Rabbi Yotza, we're not going to take from the Trumas Halishka to replace those birds that became pasul, but rather we're going to tax the seller, and that's considered the expanded contractual agreement between the seller and the Beis Hamikdash. It's not enough that he just simply supplies the birds, but he has to guarantee that these birds will be muktar, will be mukrav al gabi mizbeach, and if not, then the sale is off, the deal is off, and he has to replace them, according to Rabbi Yossi, with another set of birds. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you find an animal in Yerushalayim and it's a male animal, you assume it's an ola. A female animal, you assume it's shlomim. I mean, what's going on over here? Shlomim could be either male or female. There's a 50% chance that the animal you found is shlomim. Now, shlomim can be eaten for 2 days. An ola can't be eaten at all. So you're going to have to take this karban, this animal that you shechted as an ola, you're going to have to burn it on the mizbeach. When it's a karban shlomim, perhaps, if it's a zachar. Even a zachar could be shlomim. And therefore you're taking basar kodesh that could be eaten for 2 days and has to be eaten for 2 days, and you're destroying it by burning it on the mizbeach. Rav Yoshaya Rabbah, the great Rav Yoshaya, said, Omar, that, you know what, we're not going to be makriv the animal. That's not what the Mishnah has in mind. But rather, lebab b'dmeim shana. The person who finds this animal has to do whatever he has to do in order that there should be a takana for this animal, that all possibilities should be covered. And here I'm going to read a summary of Rashi in Masechet Kedushin, because this is a sugya in Masechet Kedushin in the Bavli. And Rashi says that the finder doesn't pay to find animals in Yerushalayim. He's got to pay for 2 animals, even though he only found 1 animal. Olav lahavi mos kishivu shtei behemos. And he's going to say the following condition. He's going to make the following declaration. Some of this money is for a korban olah, and some of this money is for a korban shlomim. If the animal that I found is an olah, then let that sanctity of the olah be transferred onto these mos, half of the mos that he brings, and the other mos will be shalmi nedava. I will give as a voluntary korban shlomim. If on the other hand the animal that I found is a shlomim, then let the kedusha of this animal that I found of shlomim be mischaleles, be transferred over to the mos, and those are the mos of shlomim, and the mos of olah will be dedicated for olas nedava. And mimanavshach, no matter how you slice the cake, he's covered all the bases for this animal that he found. And this reflects the Shita Rabbi Meir, who says that you could be machalel a behemas kodshim. So Rabbi Yochanan immediately objects to Rabbi Hoshaya, Amalei Rabbi Yochanan. Are we going to tell a person to be machal the kedusha of kodshim? We are only allowed to do a chilul on kodshim if there was a mum. But here we're talking about tmimim. And the pasuk says, "Vayikra chav zayin v'im bebehema tmeya ufada be'erkecha." And the Gemara Menachos on Daf Kuf Aleph interprets this pasuk that we're talking about mum, and he was poded about mum. But as far as tmimim is concerned, if the animal is not blemished at all, you're not allowed to be poded. How then can we possibly advocate that the finder should be machal the behema deliberately? And here there's a comment to the Rashter Leo and others who say that even Rabbi Meir agrees that l'chatchila you're not allowed to be machal the behema tmima that was kodshim. Ella, says Rabbi Yochanan, the Mishnah never meant to say that we could be machalel the kedusha of behemas kodshim, like Rabbi Yoshaya Rabbah says. And how do we answer the kasha that was bothering Rabbi Yoshaya Rabbah's mind? Maybe a zachar is a carbon shlomim. The answer is hilchu b'machar rov. Im rov zacharim olos. If he finds an animal that's a male animal, most of the male animals in kodshim are actually olos, meaning olos are more common than shlomim. Why? Because shlomim is either a carbon chova, or if it's an adava, then it could be female and it could be male. But most people would rather voluntarily bring a carbon ola than a shlomim. What's the advantage of bringing a carbon ola over shlomim? An ola is mechaper on mitzvahs aseh and on an essay, what's called a lava b'mechal essay. In any event, the kapara power of an ola is much more all-encompassing than that of a shlomim. So therefore, rov zacharim olos. In rov nekevos, if most of the animals that are female are zivchei shlomim, he can bring it as a carbon shlomim, even though a nekeva could also be a chatos, but that's rare relative to shlomim. So the Gemara is not happy with Rabbi Yochanan. You're telling me that there are more male animals that are kodshim that are olos than behemos? I don't accept that. In my mind, it's 50-50. There are as many shlomim as there are olos. That's how the Pnei Moshe, who's the super commentator of Yerushalmi, interprets this Gemara. But rather, Ketzad hu oseh, what should he do over here? Motzion lechulin, he should wait until a mum falls on this animal that he found, and then he's allowed to be machal them, according to everybody. The choser v'oso son, he will turn to chafam and beis olos. What does it mean, olos? In other words, he's going to have to bring 2 behemos, as we said before, and he'll make a t'nai that if this behemoth that he found was an ola, this should be an ola, and the second one would be shalmi nedava. If on the other hand the animal that he found was a shlomim, this should be shlomim, and he's bringing a second animal as an olas nedava.